Welcome back. The first thing you'll notice is I'm somewhere different. That's because I'm currently on holiday, but I did bring my camera and my microphone and just something I can use to bring up some videos should I have any request to respond to something, which I have. I've actually had two. This one is from Eduardo Jorge Falco, who asked me to have a look at this video, in fact the last 10 minutes of it, because it's from the Sampania labs, and I believe it's on the subject of the paper that came out recently in which somebody underwent cardiac arrest while they happened to have brain sensors on, and we could determine what the brain was doing during that time. It's been quite widely reported, but this is Sampania's thoughts on that paper. So I said I'd have a look and just let you know what I think. And probably can't add that much because Sampania is the expert in this kind of thing. I'm certainly not. But I'll have a look and let you know what I think from my perspective.
So I'm going to try to get in a few more questions. I do want to ask this question because it is about a recent paper that made international headlines, and I'm sure many people on the panel and also in the audience have heard of. But it was a recent paper by a doctor in Louisville who they had a man hooked up to an EEG. And they were recording his brain waves, and it just so happened that he had died while the EEG was connected.
As opposed to died, I believe he had a cardiac arrest. Again, it comes back to what's the definition of death. So we'll just say at this point he underwent a cardiac arrest, I believe.
So we were able to get, all of the brain activity that occurred during death or during the death process. So I'm just going to go ahead and read the question that was asked here. It says, the data shows that the gamma waves spiked just before the man underwent cardiac arrest. Do you think that this could be due to his consciousness starting to, quote, decouple from his brain, and that the process was fully completed when the man died or just after?
I think it'd be difficult to say that the spike in brainwaves before cardiac arrest would be the decoupling of consciousness from the brain. That would be kind of a conclusion you'd draw if you already had the assumption that consciousness and brain are separate, which you couldn't really draw at all from that observation or from that recording. So let's just see where it goes.
We can also just talk about what people's thoughts are on that paper if you have read it. I think I spoke to some of the panelists before about it, and they had some opinions. So.
Send the question to somebody in the audience. You've spoken to the panelists. You've spoken to the panelists. I'm happy to address it quickly, and then if anyone else wants to jump in, I didn't see anyone unmute themselves. But I think what's fascinating is that, we're understanding in medicine, and I would love to hear Lindsay's view. We're also busy that sometimes we don't get a chance to talk, and this is an opportunity for us to talk amongst ourselves too. So, we rely on clinical tests of consciousness, and we look to see if there are people who are able to move their arms, if their eyes, if they're able to speak. This is the so-called Glasgow Coma Scale, and we use basically clinical markers of responsiveness to determine if someone is conscious or not. And what I think is becoming incredibly clear is that those tests are not adequate to determine if someone has consciousness. And consciousness being the mystery that we've been discussing tonight is obviously a different story, but even at these tests are not. And what's incredible at death is that we see the brain shuts down. But what is really remarkable is that what seems to be happening in the same way that the body is trying to save itself. And so it basically, you sort of start to send all the blood to the heart and the brain as much as you can, and you sacrifice the arms, the legs, the gut, and other parts of the body to save yourself. What seems to be happening with death is that although most of the brain becomes, inhibited and is being shut down, which is what we would expect, because maybe it's no longer relevant to keeping you alive. But what seems to then be happening is that this sort of leads to a disinhibition of parts of the brain that would otherwise not be accessible under ordinary circumstances, like how we're talking today. And it might be that at death, what we're seeing is this phenomena occurring. You're shutting down the parts that are no longer relevant, but in so doing, you're unearthing a part that had been dampened down ordinarily in life. And that's giving you access to aspects of reality, to dimensions of reality that you would otherwise not have. And for instance...
So I think what he's saying here, and I'm very confused on Pioneer's position, because he seems to go back and forth between them a lot. I think what he's saying at the moment is at the time of death, it seems to be, or it could be, that as the brain's shutting down, the activity is being drawn away from certain aspects or certain parts of the brain that's not necessary for survival, and is being distributed somewhere else in the brain, which is giving you more access to a more disinhibited aspect of life. So your experience is more rich because that brain activity that would have been sent to non-essential areas of the brain are now being sent to other parts of the brain in more concentrated areas, which, I mean, you can speculate. Certainly, it's possible, but I don't see why why the brain would send all of its resources to heightened consciousness centers, because heightened consciousness is not essential to survival. That would be taking resources away from things like systems like keeping the heart going, the circulatory system going, and other. I mean, a heightened state of consciousness isn't really necessary to survival. Certainly, microorganisms and lower species of animals, lower in the terms of their brain development, don't have extremely heightened sense of consciousness, at least as far as we can discern. Of course, we can't put ourselves in the position of animals, but I don't see how or why the brain would consider heightened states of consciousness a necessity for survival. Maybe it's just a side effect of that. Those resources being sent away or sent to the survival aspects, and maybe on its way there, it's kind of activating these other brain regions that allow for heightened consciousness. Fair enough, yeah, that's a hypothesis, not one that I would immediately draw, because to me that seems a bit out of the way of the data that we have, especially the veridical perception aspect of things. And I'm not sure the mechanisms as to how that could be without first understanding how the brain develops consciousness, if it does. So I think very early to draw the conclusion that that's what's going on here, and again, that is a result of the brain creating consciousness and these other parts of it that aren't normally active being activated, or being more activated, I suppose.
That includes this entire lucid experience that's occurring with consciousness. And so, we have to think that might be an evolutionary mechanism, something that's programmed, and that's why everyone's having it, and we have to take it a little bit more seriously. And with respect to the paper that...
However, I mean, everybody who, or not, maybe it'd be difficult to say everybody, because I haven't spoken to everybody, nor has anyone else in the world spoken to everybody who's had a near-death experience, or an experience of death. But it could be an evolutionary trait, which is why most people who have a near-death experience this. But the heart stopping is effectively a universal experience of death. Whenever somebody dies, you can be pretty sure that it's because their heart stopped. And not everybody experiences a near-death experience. So if this is, or doesn't experience consciousness during the death process, as far as we can tell, maybe they do, but some, many who report coming back, the majority who report coming back usually say they didn't experience anything. It was just like the light switched off and then switched back on again. So if this is an evolutionary thing common to all people, you would expect that everybody would experience consciousness during cardiac arrest, and that doesn't seem to be the case. Now, it could be a variety of different reasons as to why that would be. Maybe some drugs that are induced or that are included during the procedure while they undergo cardiac arrest could act as an amnesic kind of system. Quite ironic that I forget the name of the drugs for amnesia that induce amnesia. I think it's just amnesics. And that could also explain why some people don't, or the majority of people don't have near-death experiences, because the drugs also induce this effect if they take place. But then many that take place naturally without any drugs, just people that go into cardiac arrest on the street or in their homes, most of those also don't report anything. So that may not be the case. I would just expect that if this was an evolutionary trait common to all people, you would expect a much higher rate of conscious experience being reported during cardiac arrest than we currently do. Though I don't know. Again, this is just what I would think from what I know so far. He's the expert. I'd listen to him a lot more than me, but this is just my thoughts on it.
The question was asking, what this doctor was able to show was that you were getting this sort of surge of gamma activity, which is a very high frequency brain activity, just after death, just after the heart had stopped, which we would expect not to occur.
So did the doctor report a spike of activity after the heart stopped or before? Because I'm sure she said it was before. Now he's saying it was after. Let's have a look. Let's double check that, because Eduardo did also send me a link. Here we present from a dying human brain obtained from cardiac arrest after traumatic subdural hematoma. Seen after cardiac arrest, gamma were decreased, but a high percentage of relative gamma were observed when compared to. So it looks like it was after the heart stopped, not before.
And so it might be that that's a marker. They're proposing that might be a marker to illustrate that this is when the person is having this lucid life review that we've just talked about. It may well be. We have other evidence from our patients that supports that as well, and those papers are going to be published soon. The problem is, of course, that individual didn't live, and so we don't know if they actually had an experience. But certainly it's something to think about, because ordinarily, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lindsay, or Dawn and others, that this gamma activity is seen in states of heightened consciousness. And the fact that it was observed after the heart stopped, someone gone beyond death, was remarkable in its own right.
Yeah, I think, sort of thinking about, we talked about sort of a little bit, I think you referenced at the beginning.
So I wonder if heightened gamma experiences are seen in general states of heightened consciousness. From what I could see on the very short reading of the actual report that I saw, the abstract of it, it said relative high gamma, although they all dropped. There was relatively high gamma activity during the cardiac arrest. So I wonder if that relative heightening of gamma compared to the other brain waves, whether that was still enough activity to warrant a heightened level of consciousness, because a standard level of consciousness, standard brain activity readings are required for consciousness experience, even not a lucid consciousness experience. Just for general consciousness experience, a certain level of brain activity throughout all bands are necessary. So you would expect that even though gamma, perhaps during this case, was heightened relative to the others, even the fact that they had all dropped, of course, as you'd expect during cardiac arrest, would that then be able to explain heightened lucidity? Because although the gamma was recorded to be relatively higher, it was still much lower than it would have been during normal consciousness experience. So you would argue then that the gamma radiation, or the gamma brain waves alone are responsible for the level of lucidity we experience. And although all the bands had dropped, because that gamma was relatively higher than normal against the others, that would explain heightened lucidity, I think, is what kind of the argument would be. I'm not sure about that, but we'll see. He did say he had other evidence from his own research to back that up, so it'll be interesting to see when that comes out.
Sort of chemical changes that happen sort of immediately after death, and we know also in other types of brain injury, sort of traumatic brain injury, and these kinds of things where something happens and then you get sort of what's called this kind of excitotoxic sort of cascade, where there's a flood of these chemicals that normally live inside the neurons, that then, because either the neurons are injured or because of some other mechanism that triggers this, you get sort of a flood of this excitatory, in particular a neurotransmitter called glutamate, which is the major excitatory neurotransmitter in the nervous system. And so, we don't know kind of what is the subjective experience of having that excitotoxic surge. Like, we sort of talk about it from the outside and say this is damaging and it kind of causes problems, but
yeah. So the release of glutamate and other, as you said, excitatory chemicals during death, and we don't know what that equates to in terms of experience. Again, it could lead to heightened levels of lucidity. The question you'd have to ask is the amount that is released by the neurons of a sufficient dosage to cause, hallucinatory experiences or levels of heightened experience chemically? And also, I suppose the other question would be, are they capable of giving the same level of heightened experience even though the rest of the brain waves are considerably lower? I don't know if that's ever been asked before during a flood of glutamate, which I suppose it wouldn't be, because that's effectively there's no recovery from that. As far as I'm aware, once you reach to that stage, it's game over. And again, it's all well and good showing these gamma band, relative gamma band increases and floods of chemicals. But again, until we have a causative mechanism as to how non-conscious matter can give rise to conscious experience, which is a phenomenon unlike any other concept on Earth, like digestion or whatever else, because we can see chemically how that takes place. We can't with awareness and with conscious experience. So until we have that mechanism as to how it could possibly arise from matter, from the brain, in its complexity, we always come up against the hard problem of consciousness and the fact that these are all correlations, non-causative or whatever, no relationship other than the relationship itself. We can't tell if it's a causative relationship or not, because it could very easily not be. Until we know for sure, we can't really make a claim or a conclusion one way or the other.
It may be that you're, in the moment sort of having this expanded or heightened experience that is showing up on scans as kind of increased brain activity, and that might be subjectively experienced as something kind of outside of the realm of normal daily existence.
Let me just read that passage of the actual study again to make sure I'm reading it right. An increase of absolute power in gamma activity in the narrow and broad bands and a decrease in theta power is seen after suppression of bilateral hemispheric responses. After cardiac arrest, delta, beta, alpha and gamma power were decreased, but a higher percentage of relative gamma power was observed when compared to interritical interval. I don't know what that means, nor do I know what bilateral hemispheric responses are, nor do I know what an increase of absolute power means, because I'm not a neuroscientist. But from what I can understand of what that means, especially this part, after cardiac arrest, delta, beta, alpha and gamma power were decreased, but a higher percentage of relative gamma power. So I think I'm right when I say that all the bands of brainwaves were decreased overall, but gamma was decreased a lot less relative to the others. So again, the question is, can conscious experience at all, let alone heightened lucidity of consciousness, can that be possible even though all brain waves were decreased from where standard consciousness levels are? In which case you would have to then kind of conclude that gamma gamma brain waves are responsible for the lucidity experienced. But again, we can't say are responsible for, because it could just be, and it is just a correlation observation. You could argue that heightened levels of gamma bands are correlated with higher levels of lucidity, but you can't really conclude that gamma bands are responsible for or cause heightened levels of conscious experience.
Sense.
Okay, so we are running out of time, so I think I'm gonna just cut the questions there. There are some questions here about if the panel was recorded, and
so I think that's going to be the end of that segment. Let me just have a look at, I don't know if the full version of this entry is available. Right, this looks like the full report, or the commentary from Grayson, Lommel and Fennick. Let me see if we can find... it's not that long. Okay, let's see what it says. In February 2022, Vicente et al. Published an article in the Frontiers of Aging Neuroscience that described continuous electroencephalography recording in an 87-year-old patient who... So that's what they're reporting what was seen. Bros in Delta were decreased, but a higher percentage of relative gamma power was observed. Oh, okay, so it explains what that interval is the period between seizures. Okay, and cross-frequency coupling, interactions between brainwaves and difference. Okay, so maybe I was wrong when I thought that when they said could it be the consciousness decoupling from the brain? Maybe that's not kind of in a metaphysical sense. Maybe that's just terminology I don't know about. revealed modulation of left hemispheric gamma activity by alpha and theta rhythms. Not a clue. So the authors wrote with appropriate caution, given that cross-coupling between alpha and gamma activity is involved in cognitive processes and memory recall in healthy subjects. Given that cross-coupling between alpha and gamma activity is involved in cognitive and memory. Right, so let me just double check what coupling is. Interactions between brainwaves at different frequencies. So alpha and gamma bands of activity interacting together is responsible for cognitive processes and memory recall in standard healthy subjects. Is it interesting such activity could support a large recall of life that may take place in a near-death state? To their credit, Vicente et al. Appropriately ended their report by acknowledging that the lack of any normal brain electrical activity recorded from the patient that could serve as a baseline for comparison cast doubt on any interpretation of the finding. So, effectively, they didn't have a control of a healthy subject to compare the brainwaves to, and naturally, because the patient died, the camera's on a very wobbly surface, so I just get a wobble every now and then. Because the patient died, they can't compare his experience of consciousness during the cardiac arrest to someone who was healthy and then compare what those readings could mean. Subsequent mainstream media reports went far beyond the author's modest statement that it is intriguing to speculate, which is correct, which is what they should have said, and proclaimed that this single case proved that the near-death experiences were explained entirely by brain electrical activity persisting for several minutes after cardiac arrest, which it certainly does not, because again, A, it's one case, B, we don't have that comparison, we don't know what the person actually experienced, so how could you conclude anything about the near-death experience without knowing what that person experienced? And also, again, without that initial mechanism of consciousness from non-conscious matter, we can only go as far as correlation, as far as I can see. Although we agree that this case is intriguing, we believe that data from this patient does not suggest that brain electrical activity is responsible for the life review often reported to occur in near-death experiences. And even if it is, then you've got veridical perception to come up against. You've got Pekingerian experiences during near-death phenomena and things like that. It's all well and good to speculate, but I agree with Grace and the others in the sense that mainstream media arguing that this is proof that near-death experiences are created by brain electrical activity is not an accurate interpretation of the study. Vicente et al. Reported that the patient displayed a temporary increase in gamma power when bilateral hemispheric activity ceased, but that it declined after what the authors described as a cardiac arrest. In other words, the EEG recorded from this patient did not show the increase in absolute gamma activity after cardiac arrest that was speculated to be responsible for at least a life review, but showed a reduction in absolute gamma waves after cardiac arrest. Did not show the increase in absolute gamma, but showed a reduction. Yeah, so the absolute gamma, which I guess is kind of the overall activity, gamma activity, dropped in cardiac arrest, which you'd expect, but relative to the other bands, it was slightly higher. So to kind of illustrate it, and I don't know the measurements of brainwaves, but if alpha, beta, gamma, and theta were all at, say, 10 during normal healthy awareness, alpha, beta, and theta maybe dropped to 3 during cardiac arrest, and gamma dropped to maybe 7. So although gamma was relatively higher because all the others were at 3 and gamma was at 7, it still wasn't at 10 where it originally was. So the absolute reduction was lower by 3 points, but relative to the others, which were at a reduction of 7 points, it was relatively higher. So again, the question is, could that overall reduction in brainwaves be allow for conscious experience to take place at heightened lucidity, which you would have to say then that heightened lucidity, or the level of lucidity, is determined by the level of gamma in relation to the others. Right. Regarding the source of gamma oscillations, Vicente will notice that increased gamma power and long-range gamma synchronization have been identified in conscious perception, but increased gamma power and synchronization have also been found across the cortex in association with a wide variety of brain circumstances. Muthukumara Swami. Ranging from ongoing pain to preparation for and execution of movements. To their credit, Vicente et al. Listed several reasons not to place too much importance on this one patient's EEG. They noticed first that the patient's traumatic brain injury and subdermal hematoma may have idiosyncratically influenced brain electrical activity, including gamma waves. Second, they recognised that the patient's anesthesia-induced loss of consciousness might have influenced his gamma and other electrical activity. Right. So I don't really think there'll be much that is really necessary to read on through that, because it made the necessary conclusions. Okay, and now I'm somewhere else again because I was just going to finish off that video, but then the internet went out. I was down in Cornwall for a week, and although you'd have thought that Cornwall would have good internet because of its closeness to the masts, this house didn't. It was absolutely terrible. I was fortunate I was even able to play the video itself. But the internet then completely went out, and so I haven't been able to do anything until we got back here in Dorset, which still isn't my home, but it's our holiday home that we bought last year, luckily. So now I'm here, so I'll just do the outro to the video from here. So I think Grayson et al., who wrote the review to the report by Vicente et al., are quite right when they say that the evidence of the gamma rays, I keep saying, because every time I think of gamma I think of radiation, but gamma brain waves spiking kind of relative to the others after cardiac arrest can't really be used as evidence that is what causes near-death experiences, simply for the fact that it was a spike in gamma relative to the others and not an absolute increase. In fact, it was an absolute decrease in gamma, alpha, beta and theta. It's just that gamma dropped slightly less than the others. That's kind of one reason. So we'd have to determine if gamma alone is responsible for lucidity of consciousness, whereas the others maybe don't matter so much, and whether normal consciousness is possible with those other bands being lowered. Second of all, of course, we can't compare the experiences between a near-death experiencer and the person who we recorded, or say we collectively as science recorded their brainwaves for, because that person unfortunately died, so we don't know what they experienced and if they did have a near-death experience or not. If we're right in that near-death experiences are evidence of some form of continuation, then he would have done, but unfortunately he can't come back and tell us about that. So without that comparison, we can't really tell whether this relatively high gamma band activity was responsible for near-death experience, or is responsible for near-death experiences. We can't tell, and it is certainly very unwise, I suppose, of the media to make it appear so, although you'd understand it because the media are generally out for shocking headlines to sell their papers. So if you have anything else you'd like me to give my thoughts on, feel free to drop me an email or a message on the Discord or the Facebook with any articles or videos you'd like me to give my thoughts on, and I will certainly do so. Thanks everyone.